So yeah, I obviously have to give my spiel for Young Voices, even though every single one of you in here probably knows what we are already. But on behalf of Young Voices, I want to thank you guys for coming. So we are a nonprofit that is, we exist to help young policy wonks get into mainstream media. We've done that for going on 10 years now, so it's been a minute. So yeah, if you guys are, if you're under the age of 35, if you're interested in policy, interested in writing, we are a very good organization for you to look at the website up. But yeah, enough about us. I want to kind of get the ball rolling with our event. So introducing our speakers. First, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Luke Hogg. I think a couple of you here know this guy. So Luke is he's the Director of Outreach for Beacon Network, which is an organization that we love to partner with when we can. He generally, in terms of policy, likes to focus on technological innovation and public policy. He was originally a federal affairs manager at FreedomWorks, where he focused on blockchain, internet governance, regulatory issues. And he's a current innovation fellow with Young Voices, of which we have several here tonight, which is very exciting. Thank you, I appreciate the snaps. Thank you. So, for our speakers, the four that are seated at the center, I'm going to start out introducing Liz Wolfe, who is an editor at Reason Magazine. Give it up to Liz. So Liz was formerly my boss. Just years ago at this point, so it's nice to see her here again. She now is at Reason after having a little byway path at the Federalist. She's focusing right now on tech, free speech in China, and her writing. You just did a cool video on, what was it? It was about innovation and just in like the ways that things are getting better, which is cool.
Basically, like different technologies that 5 billion people may use by 2050. So, yeah.
Kind of like ChatGPT.
Yeah, technologies that 36 million people use right now, but eventually 5 billion will. So
Right.
sort of like smartphones, internet, stuff like that.
Right, sure. It's very cool. Check out Liz's work after this, if you have not already. And then we have John Asconis, who is a professor at the Catholic University of America. Give it up for John. John is a very interesting fellow. He works a lot with the Beacon Network, which is how we became acquainted with him. He works on connections between Republican tradition, technology, and national security. His writing has appeared in a lot of different outlets, and he's got some really in-depth views. We're excited to hear about those tonight. Next, we have Will Reinhardt. He works for the Center of Growth and Opportunity. Give it up for Will. He's a senior research fellow there. He specializes in telecommunication, internet, and data policy with focus on emerging technologies and innovation. Will has worked for a lot of different places, so I'm not going to read all that. But it's great to have him here because he definitely knows what he's talking about when it comes to tech. So it'll be great to hear his viewpoints. And then next we have Matt Middlestad, who works for the Mercatus Center. Give it up for Matt. He is a technologist and research fellow at the Mercatus Center. His work focuses on AI, cybersecurity, decentralized finance policy. He was a fellow at the Institute of Security, Policy, and Law, where he researched AI judicial policy and AI arms control verification mechanisms. I don't know what that stuff means, but it sounds really good.
How to implement potential AI weapon.
Okay.
A lot of people are talking about the UN, but no one's talking about
Right. Thank God we're not the UN right now. So anyway, these are our speakers, and I'm so excited to have them here. I'm happy to have you guys here too. I know a lot of you work in policy, so thank you for coming tonight to hear about more policy. But yeah, I'll let you guys take it away. Somebody needs to speak.
Thanks you guys too, yeah. Thanks, Emma. Thanks to Young Voices. Thanks to Microsoft for hosting. Thanks for y'all for coming down tonight. So I think just a little while ago, AI was really a niche issue. It was something that was science fiction, people didn't really want to talk about. And then obviously with the release of DALL-E and ChatGPT and some of these new tools, it really has exploded into the cultural consciousness and the social consciousness, and then obviously the policy consciousness. So I'm really glad that we can have this conversation here. Just to be clear, for any effective altruists in the room, we're not talking about general AI. So like, we're not talking about Terminator, we're not talking about Skynet. That's a conversation for the future. What we want to talk about is generative AI. These things that are just starting to come onto the scene and just starting to make a huge impact, and they will continue to make a huge impact on practically all manners of society. So obviously these things came onto the scene, and there's been a lot of hand-wringing. There's been a lot of positive things written about ChatGPT, GPT-3, and these other models. There's been a lot of negative things written, and a lot of speculation just across the board when it comes to these things. So first, I want to come to Liz, because to what degree do you feel that the hand-wringing, specifically the negative hand-wringing, is justified when we're talking about some of these technologies?
It is perhaps unsurprising that the lady from Reason dislikes all the hand-wringing and the fear-mongering. I think that this is actually going to be really, really awesome technology. And it's a little bit difficult to see that right now. I can understand people's trepidation. I'm especially interested in the Catholic perspective here as a Catholic myself, because I think it's important to consider what types of things about humanness will this reveal to us. And I think there's so much that we can go into on that front, so I definitely want to get there. But I mean, look, I have a newborn baby at home, and I went back to work at Reason, and I'm trying to go on a trip to Romania to visit some family in a few weeks. ChatGPT is planning my vacation. Like, legitimately, you might not think that it can do that, but you just input a few different prompts, tell it, I would like to go on a 10-day trip, please plan me an itinerary, and it's basically serving as a travel agent for me right now. When interviewing somebody, though I have not done this yet, I still feel a little bit queasy about it, which I'm telling on myself, but when interviewing somebody for like a show like Rising, where we sometimes, which I do sometimes, where we have guests on, okay, well, if I want to understand what they wrote about in their recent book, I can ask ChatGPT to generate a summary of that. I think it's important when leaning on it as this research tool to not let ourselves get away from a lot of the value that we can actually still glean from good old-fashioned books. So as writers, which many of us are, being able to be influenced by the beautiful and literary phrasing of that old antiquated technology and being able to smell the pages of books. Like, there is absolutely still a place for that. And I think it's really important that we continue to value that going forward. But when we're short on time and we want to understand a book that somebody has recently written because we need to interview them for some sort of journalistic purpose, this is something that is going to just be a huge time saver, allowing us to be so much more efficient than ever before. We will be in this role of auditor and overseer and pruner, and in a sense, it's now that taste is more important than ever. We are in this position of discernment, where basically it's going to generate a gazillion different designs, a gazillion different questions, a gazillion different things, and we will have to go through that and assess what is worth keeping and what's worth discarding. And so I can understand people feeling some amount of trepidation about that. But I personally am very excited for my new tastemaker auditing role with ChatGPT, and I've already found ways for it to be a huge time saver in my life.
So John, especially since Liz kind of called you out immediately there, you've written a lot about how we should be thinking about technology and how we should be building technology specifically to reflect our values rather than just building technology for the simple purpose of building technology. So kind of what would your response be to what Liz just said, and kind of how are you thinking about this, and what sort of risks and even benefits are you looking at when it comes to chat?
Yeah, great question. I think people might be surprised to hear that I'm also very bullish on generative AI. And I do think there are risks, but I think that the risks are different than what some of our friends in the psychologist community might have. There's this notion in Dante draws on a contrapasso of the punishment of the sin is in some way related to the sin itself, the end of the sin itself. The punishment for lust is being consumed by lust. The punishment for greed is being consumed by greed. And I think that generative AI poses a kind of contrapasso for our society, depending on our view of the human person. If you view humans as fundamentally meat computers, fundamentally minds whose value is determined by their ability to reason, then AI is a huge threat to you, because your meat computer is going to be outclassed by this, multi-trillion node language model, right? But if your view of the human is rooted in the Imago Dei, is rooted in is rooted in embodiment and in creation, then it's not a threat. It's another tool. I think that the danger that it might pose to us is not so much replacing jobs or whatever, but to the extent that we forget all those other parts of being human and how we want to use the technology. Do we recognize that when you're wanting to see a doctor or a teacher or an agent of the state or whatever, that there's actually, you're not just looking to them for information and therefore they can be replaced by a computer? Do we recognize those other parts of being human? So I think those are the kind of risks that I see, but I think it's a hugely creative tool as well.
Well, Will, how would you sort of respond to that, right? Maybe not ChatGPT, but in the near future, in 5 years, with the development of some of these technologies, do you really see it more as a tool that's going to benefit us, or could it potentially, be overtaking some of our humanness and this counting stuff?
I think that's what I hate to yes and this, but I think that's exactly what we're going through right now. We're trying to figure out what these technologies mean in our own lives, separate from any of the AI, generative AI talks that we're having now. We're trying to figure out what social media still means in our lives. We're still trying to figure out even what a cell phone means in our lives. This thing that's right next to our bed oftentimes at night, right? And it's the embedding and the adoption of those technologies, I think, are obviously something that it's we're constantly having these discussions. And I think that John is exactly right about this, right? You're exactly right about that these technologies kind of ask us to question ourselves and question where our own position is within society, which I think it's really interesting then that I feel like most people here are kind of bullish on this technology, relatively speaking. And what's interesting is that the people who think that, that there's going to be there's going to be disruption, but there's going to be massive disruption, there's going to be massive change, are the people who do think that the only thing that they provide for society is kind of a thinking, they're a thinking animal, which isn't the only thing that individuals provide when they're in a firm or an organization, right? So to me, again, my long-term prediction is generally speaking, I think that there are going to be some groups who really seriously benefit from it. Most of us are probably going to benefit, tremendously from these technologies. We're going to be able to do more. I'm already able to do more and able to edit quicker and to find stuff much easier, not through ChatGPT, but through ResearchRabbit and through WordTune. A whole bunch of other kind of related technologies are using very similar kind of, core tech. But what I think that eventually, as we've seen for the last 120 years with all these other, interestingly enough, called general purpose technologies, right? These things that change everything, like electricity, like tractors, robotic machines that create, robotic machines that create cars. All these things have a very specific kind of nature. And that nature is that it takes time to adapt to it, and that ultimately it takes time for these things to actually be used by people. And the people who do use it, some do much, much better, and some end up they don't adapt to the technologies, and that creates weird sort of things that are happening. We could go into it, but it's the most interesting thing that I would say about that we've seen effectively over the last 100 years is that as we become wealthier, there's actually a higher demand for the stuff that is not tech enabled, right? The wealthier we get, there's actually more of a demand for service level jobs and stuff that is more task intensive, as it's called. And that's a really interesting sort of tension we see in the economy, that the production of better productivity of stuff that's related to ChatGPT, that it actually is probably in the future going to create more demand for service level jobs, and it's going to continue creating that kind of bifurcated nature, which we've already seen. And I think that's kind of the thing that I'm looking at is this, I don't want to call it inequality because it's not exactly inequality, but there is kind of a bifurcation between people who are using technologies and people who aren't using technologies.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, and I do want to put a pin in it. But Matt, do you have a response?
Yeah, can I add one thing? I just want to add that I think people tend to assume that automation, with all these amazing new technologies like ChatGPT, is a one-way street. Like, we're always going to trend towards more and more automation. And I don't think that's necessarily 100% the case. That's often the case, but it's not always the case. And I do think that if we ever do hit a point with ChatGPT or any other variation of AI technology that we have removed humans too much from the equation, I think what will happen is we are going to correct back towards adding humanity back into the equation. Now, in terms of history, there's actually some evidence to suggest that this can happen. This has happened, at least in one instance that comes to mind for me before. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of what automats are. Automatic restaurants. And this was a fad back in the 1940s and 50s, back when automation, just as a raw concept, was a really hot, new, cool thing. Essentially what these were was you'd still have the back of the house chefs cooking the food fresh and hot for the patrons, but the entire front of the house was automated. They essentially had a series of vending machines that you could use to get your food. Now, clearly automats are not a thing that you can go to anymore. I don't think there's a single one that exists. And I don't 100% know the reason why those died off, but I can tell you I think it's because people, as the automation fad faded, and it stopped being trendy, people realized that it was cold, right? They had automated a bit too much and removed too much humanity, and so the market corrected. We brought the service back, we brought the cashiers back, bartenders, etc., and the automat went the way of the dinosaur. So the point here is that automation isn't a surefire thing, and the market does work. Like, it can correct when we overstep things. And there's definitely evidence to support that.
Well, Matt, I think it's interesting because there's this idea in kind of tech world generally that it's honestly sometimes worse to be too early than too late. So, for example, there's a McDonald's. The only reason I know this is because I'm from Texas. There's a McDonald's in Fort Worth right now that is totally automated, and they just opened several months ago. So, Liz, how do you feel about that? Do you think that this is something? Perhaps are some of these tools coming too early or too late? What do you think about this idea of robotics and automation as a kind of a proxy? Because I have seen this in pieces. People have used automation as an example when talking about AI.
Well, I think it's interesting because we're actually in this fascinating time right now, both with the development of these large language models, these LLMs, but we're also in this really interesting time for delivery drones, actually. Speaking of Texas, Amazon has now debuted in one town in California and in one town in Texas their first ever delivery drones that are actually beginning to deliver Amazon packages to customers. We see the exact same thing happening in China right now. They've had a fair bit of regulation from their aviation authority there, but we're seeing Meituan and a few other companies really beginning to deliver, especially food to consumers. So basically, DoorDash in China is essentially using drone technology now, and we're at the very, very beginning of this. But I think we're seeing this really wild time where we're trying to figure out how do we get physical goods to people in a way that's faster and more efficient than ever before, while also trying to figure out what the role of ChatGPT and other LLMs is in making people in their jobs faster and more efficient than ever before. So I think we run the risk with all these things of people getting a little bit creeped out by all of this happening too fast, and by them struggling to figure out how to incorporate this to actually make themselves more, efficient and productive. I think there's a very easy criticism that people on the more conservative side would lodge, which is, okay, well, it's not just about us being as efficient as possible. We're not trying to become robots. That's not the only metric by which we judge success. But I do think it's also pretty important to pay a lot of attention to the fact that this will be a tool that will be incorporated into our arsenals. And I think the fact that we see this dual development of the physical world and technologies making it so that physical objects can be brought to us more efficiently than ever before, but also making it so that we can parse information more efficiently than ever before. I think the fact that these two things are happening at once is possibly a really good thing. But I do worry a little bit about how fast it's happening, because I think for many people, they're really struggling to figure out what this reveals about our humanness, We actually see this, I just want to make this point and then I'll pass it along. But like hallucinations, ChatGPT, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but ChatGPT basically providing people with untrue information at times. The venture capitalist Mark Andreessen recently made this absolutely wonderful point, which was basically that people are really freaked out by this. They're worried about the possible spread of misinformation and disinformation via ChatGPT, but also like, you know, this is something humans do to one another all the time. We tell people what they want to hear. We are people-pleasing machines in some ways, and that's, you know, one of our worst qualities, arguably, but it's also pretty innate to who we are and what we do. So it's not altogether surprising that this machine is also trying to be a people-pleaser. Go ahead.
The defense of disinformation from a magazine like Global Disinformation in Institute list. How surprising.
I'm
That was a
spreading it
badge
right
of honor
now.
at spreading disinformation right here in front of your eyes. Well, just to speak briefly on something you said, I do think that I actually have seen, you know, conservatives tend to be, have an inherent tendency towards Luddism, which, you know, I think there's something to several Luddism, but I actually haven't seen any of that about ChatGPT. I think the reason is that, at least in this country, the sort of post-realignment, you know, the right is interested in being a working class right, and the feeling is that the burden of automation hit the American working class very hard over the last 50 years, and that now it's finally the coastal elite's turn to have a little bit of the automation, and maybe now you can learn to code. So I don't think there has actually been that much animus about ChatGPT from the right.
You don't need to learn to code when ChatGPT will do it.
Well, exactly. So
No, but I think you touched on something interesting, right? Because there's not a lot of Luddism that's going into this, but there is a lot of anxiety, which is an interesting, I think, bifurcation there. So, even more generally, when we're talking about tech, I think that there's this conversation going on where we're trying to realign and then think about how these kind of technologies, be it social media, ChatGPT, and AI systems, what have you, and how that reflects and impacts societal values. So Matt, I'm just kind of interested in how you're thinking about that, and how does the broader conversation around AI fit into the even bigger conversation we're having right now about the role of technology in our lives, period?
I mean, I think one of the big things that it's going to cause us to question in terms of values is our skills, right? Things like writing, coding, all these things that for years, all throughout my education, people say this is what you have to value, this is what you have to develop. These raw skills, these technical skills, technical being in the broadest sense of the word, meaning like writing is a technical skill in a way. These hard skills are what's important. And I think there's going to have to be a realignment towards emphasizing soft skills. And I think very specifically, we're going to have to remind ourselves what is at the core of each of these hard skills that makes them worthwhile. So at the core of writing, why are we doing that? What does that, besides just producing words, how does that serve us? In my personal view, for me at least, I don't know, I can't speak for everyone, writing, in addition to producing a work of writing, serves the task of collecting my ideas and massaging my ideas into something worth putting out there. All of my best ideas tend to come out when I'm going through the process of writing. And so I think in general, we're just going to have to think about what are these skills useful for beyond just hard skills, producing output. Is there something more to them? And I think a lot of these things do have that, and they may be worth pursuing, regardless of whether or not they're directly useful. I think we still may need to invest in these things. I think an interesting kind of comparison to what we might be facing in terms of writing and the importance of writing in our society in a post-ChatGPT age is Latin in basically all of human history. Up until like the early 20th century, people were still in most higher education. You learn Latin from your governess in Britain or whatever. You read any Jane Austen novel, they all speak French and Latin. And that's interesting because that's not a very useful skill, but people still learned it, right? And we still, as humans, emphasized learning Latin because it makes you more worldly. It provides insight into language and culture. And it's interesting in its own right. And I think we need to just be thinking about these tasks in that way. It's like, this is a good thing to learn because it makes you more worldly, skilled in it as an individual. It's an art form. We should stop thinking of things like writing and coding as just pure hard skills.
As someone that took Latin in college. That's a complete waste of time. But
I took 6 years of Latin. I feel pretty stupid now.
I'm happy to let you guys prove me
I
wrong.
think, Matt, you bring up an interesting point, because, we should start emphasizing soft skills more, but there's also, at the same time, coding with AI and prompt generation could be its own hard skill. There are people already, advertising for jobs. What do you think about that, Will?
Yeah, no, and I think this is exactly the trend that's happening. It's not just the hard skills, it's the both of them. It's the hard skills and the soft skills. And we actually do see this, especially within the computer industry, those who are in legal space, who are in engineering, all of the, kind of, I don't want to say top-end professions, but the most expensive professions, the places where there is the highest amount of income, we see a combination of both. They have to be good communicators, they have the ability to understand their audiences and be able to, speak to their audiences, but you also see this ability to obviously do the technical work. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing, is more of that. Because when you start having an expansion of content, of stuff that is actually, I think the thing we haven't really talked about with any of these models is they're generative models. It's not necessarily that they're true models, right? And you can generate more content, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be beneficial content for any given sort of action. And so in that instance, when you've got more content, what is the thing that gets economized? The thing that gets economized is judgment. And that's where individuals, I think, are going to be part of the conversation, is on the judgment, right? And I do a lot of this work kind of day to day. It's, you go through, again, I work for kind of an educational institution, and it is a bit different because I'm helping to teach students and to do research projects, long-term research projects. A lot of what I end up doing is interpreting a paper and going through and just saying, okay, this is actually what this means. Here's the context here. I'm using ChatGPT in some regards or these kind of related technologies to do a first pass, but then it's you have to go deeper. You have to understand the technical features. You need to understand why the regression is written in a certain kind of way. And we're seeing very clearly right now, and in fact, I think it's probably a good case to say that most of the LLM models don't do that at all. They don't do they don't do the symbolic work. They do the large language, they do the NLP work, but they don't do the symbolic work. And I think that's a very important thing to know about these things, which is that, there's one side which is, symbolic, that's databases, that's regressions, that's all of the logic models, all of that. And then there's this other method, which is what we're talking about now with LLMs and ChatGPT and WordTune and all these other sorts of technologies. And understanding the bifurcations and how those two things can and do work, I think is going to be incredibly needed in the future. Yeah.
But the thing that's so interesting about what you just said, which is totally true, is that people have always been willing to pay for judgment, right? That's what sets apart the people at the very highest levels from the lowly intern. No offense if anybody in this room is an intern, but firms have always been willing to pay for judgment. And so in a sense, it's just revealing more and more fundamental truths about how we always were. I also just keep thinking about what's the alternative? You're totally correct that not all of this information that's generated will be useful, but there's also, you brought up the idea of does this replace a doctor, a human doctor? Hopefully not, because a human doctor has really valuable insight and can tailor it to the individual and treat them with empathy to help them go through difficult diagnoses. But there's also this question of we already use WebMD when we're in dire straits and we're unable to actually get good access to medical care. We don't have a doctor that we actually like. Most young people, I would imagine, haven't had a general, hadn't had a physical in years and years and years unless their parents schedule it for them, right? We like going to the doctor lapse if we're in pretty good health. And so perhaps being able to consult with I'm kind of neurotic about going to the doctor and dentist, and I just got done having a baby, which means you have to go to the doctor every week. But no, we have to consider what the alternative is. And right now, for a lot of people, WebMD is the alternative, and that also generates all kinds of not so useful information. But this could be something that gets us closer to useful information or allows us to judge what is useful and what is not.
I think on that note, and the doctor example is just an excellent example, because I think one of the biggest uses, the potential uses, perhaps not today, of this type of technology is in healthcare, where there is a rather severe labor shortage. This is an area where we just simply do not have enough bodies, right? If you do schedule your physical, if you do happen to do that task like we all should, you're only going to see your doctor for 10 minutes, and your doctor's going to come in and review everything the nurse has said, go through the checklist and leave. And that is not true care, right? That is not true bedside, ongoing check-ins with your health. There's no bandwidth to do that. And I honestly can't really imagine a society where we have enough labor to actually provide that. That seems rather difficult. We've got healthcare experts here. I'm happy to defer to her on that, but right now we don't. And I personally have struggled with a chronic pain condition, which I would love to check in with a doctor basically every week just to update them on how I'm doing, tell them about my symptoms, see how things are progressing, see how things are changing, and see if maybe that amounts to something that has yet to be diagnosed. And I can't do that because at most I'm getting the 10-minute doctor, and that's just not enough. And I think this is the type of thing that truly could augment those services where we just don't have enough labor, and in the foreseeable future we won't have it. And I think that's potentially going to be an incredible change for people's health and livelihoods.
One small little comment about that. Most of the services that are currently out have actually red teamed those questions, because if they are being perceived as though they are providing service, they are liable for any of those decisions that are made that you make, given that you're giving medical advice. And so that's another thing that basically all of them have just cut out of their entire models and said, we're not doing any of these questions, which I think is also an interesting part of this, which is the thing that I'm interested in, is the regulatory part. How is it, right? Do not pay, you can't bring do not pay into the courtroom and use it in order to push pass against a parking ticket, right? That was stopped. Like, there's no way that it's gonna supplement or at least bring innovation into the courtroom in a very real sense if there are very specific and severe limits on the ability to even adopt these technologies within given settings. And I think that's part of this equation that to me is also really fascinating, right? And one of the things I follow is railroad technology, and railroads right now are in this big fight of whether or not you can have one engineer on a train car. I think it's probably not going to change too much now, the things that have happened in East Palestine, Ohio. But this is the sort of like conversations that are constantly going on. There's questions about if these technologies could even be adopted. There's another similar thing that's going on with airplanes, whether or not you could have the number of crew that can be on airplanes. Point being is that there's this other regulatory limit that to me also provides this wall to some of these technologies being adopted and some of the benefits also from accruing.
Well, I think the domestic regulatory issue is very important, and we can kind of go down a whole rabbit hole in that. But I also kind of want to broaden this out because we've talked about everything in a very domestic, kind of consumer-focused sense. But there's also a bigger conversation going on. It's a kind of the global regulatory environment around AI systems, kind of the future of AI systems. And I mean, we would be remiss to not point out the fact that China is leading the way on AI, a totalitarian regime. So I kind of want to turn to John and see, what do you think about that? What can we do kind of on a global scene to kind of talk about some of these issues, and what should we even be talking about?
Yeah, and I think it's useful this time to kind of disaggregate AI, right? Because the kinds of AI that China is interested in building are not the kinds that we're interested in building, right? We're interested in building, broadly speaking, more open systems, more generative systems that rely less on like supermassive scale data aggregation and raise privacy concerns, systems that are, systems that fit a free society, right? They're interested in kind of the inverse of that. And that isn't simply a regulatory question. It is also a question that ties into IP, into import-export controls and whatnot. And I think we've been, Western AI researchers have been very inattentive to the obvious and not so obvious ways that the research is likely to be picked up. And to ask the ethical question of, given China's interest in AI and for authoritarian purposes, should we open source this? I remember, this may be a little, it was a few years ago when NVIDIA published this very, very large database of photographs of like portraits, facial portraits, much more racially diverse than ones that were currently available. They did this to improve, biased outcomes with facial recognition. And obviously, in our Western context, that's like a great goal. But what about the Uyghurs? Like, what are the implications of improving China's ability to do facial recognition on this subpopulation? So I think it starts by even asking the question. I do think that in DC, beginning the Trump administration, but really continuing almost without lapse in the Biden administration, there is a very serious policy discussion going on to address these questions.
Yeah, Matt, I want to turn to you next because I think that you bring up a good point, right? This is kind of, it's a big issue. We were talking about China. It's only gotten more important. We have a new select committee that's just focused on strategic competition with China. We know that technology is a big part of this conversation, and obviously AI is a big part of the tech conversation. So what do you think about the China issue?
I think people, they're making it something that it's not in general. So I think there's one fallacy when talking about who's winning in terms of AI, and that is the assumption that AI is a thing. AI is not one thing. There is no one AI. There are a bunch of applications that fall under this general umbrella, and China may or may not be leading in a given subset of these. So drones, driverless cars, and then there's ChatGPT. These things are not just different. In many cases, they're wildly different. And we need to, I think, when discussing places like China, be thinking of each application as its own sub-competition of this overall race. And I think if you start thinking like that, the picture becomes a bit more muddled, but a bit more optimistic overall too. If you look at the top 10 companies that are leading in terms of cited AI research, first of all, 6 of the top 10 companies are American companies. China is leading overall in terms of raw AI research citations, and that tends to be how people measure who is winning the AI race. And that's a fairly blunt metric, but a fine metric, I guess. But if you look at the other 4 are all Chinese companies. And one of those 4 is the Chinese state electricity grid company. And they're getting a lot of research citations. They're adding a lot to this overall lump of research. And my guess would be, I haven't looked at this research, but my guess would be is that research isn't the type of research that really represents leadership in AI. That's incredibly application specific. And it's in an area that they're not going to compete with us. We're not like in direct competition over the Chinese electric grid, right? They're competing amongst their own actors and producing research that perhaps we can benefit from. And I think that's only a net benefit. So that leaves the other 3 companies, which Baidu and such. Those are who we're actually competing with. But overall, I would say that this leadership question in terms of AI in this competition, it's framed too broadly. We're looking at things without any sort of application specificity, and I think that's a big problem. Now, in terms of who will ultimately win, right? I think if you did have to pick one variable, one type of application to measure success in AI, I would say that generative AI, like we're talking about tonight, is probably the best proxy variable for overall leadership in this race. And I would say, and I got to do a bit more research on this, mind you, but I would say, seeing as we're the ones who released ChatGPT and not China, we are probably leading that race. Baidu has said that they're going to release a competitor to ChatGPT in the coming months called Ernie for some reason. Weird branding. But they're clearly behind on at least that specific variant of generative AI. And I think that'll be a problem for them because if there's one form of AI that's going to cause wild catalytic growth, it's generative AI, because generative AI creates new things, and that's what you want to really hypercharge your economy.
Yeah.
Just make 2 brief follow-up points. I do think people are making much too much of these sort of clear metrics on Chinese science. If you look back, I did quite a fair amount of work on Chinese nanoscience back in the day, and basically the Chinese Academy of Sciences, Chinese CCP created incentives to produce and publish and get patents for nanoscience. And so what you see, massive increase in these research outputs, but often with very poor quality. So, I think once you layer in like English language citations and some other things that get to kind of the global dimension of it, it's a different picture. The second thing I would say is, going to my research area, I do think that in Washington, there's been this tendency, for maybe not so difficult to fathom military-industrial complex reasons, to aggregate or to put together Chinese dominance AI and military AI specifically. I think the places where China does have a lead on AI have very limited military applications. Even though they're working on drones, which is probably the closest, until they can really get model size down to very small, which I don't think they're really close to, I think the limitation, the utility of that in an actual military conflict is quite low. And so I do think we need to disaggregate what kind of AI we're talking about.
And it's interesting you also mentioned that that one of the biggest producers of some of this AI research is an energy company, because I mean Google has had these models since 2017, right? Or at least the transformer models that we're all talking about now. They've mostly implemented them on the energy side. They've mostly implemented them on data centers. They've had pretty massive increases in efficiency on data center side of things, something like 50 or high 40s, low 50% reduction in use. And so if you're thinking about a complex system, that actually is probably one of the better areas where these kind of brute force models could actually work, which is figuring out load balancing, which is super difficult. And it's like difficult to know exactly how much energy is going from different parts of the system. So the sort of like practical reduction, I see that probably being very beneficial. The other thing that I think is really interesting, which, to their credit, the Biden administration has had a really strong stance against the technology transfers into China. That's what happened. I think it was back in October, basically saying, if you're an American, these are all now restricted technologies. You can no longer work for these companies that are located in China. And literally the next day, everyone basically walked off the job. I think this gives us a short lead, right? They're basically trying to go into this, what's called the 10 nanometer space, and we're trying to basically right now go in probably about 2 generations later or 3 generations later. That's in like the 2 to 3 range. I think that's something to really pay attention to very closely, is how a lot of these regulatory restrictions are implemented, these trade restrictions are implemented very practically, and then also who responds to it, who comes to our side. Are the Dutch going to be working alongside with us? Are you going to see, obviously you've seen more investment with the Taiwanese, with a lot of the kind of upstream products that go into this system. The other thing that we really haven't talked about, we've talked a little bit about ChatGPT, which for the models, we haven't talked at all about the hardware, right? And the hardware is incredibly important. The reason why we're even having this conversation is because OpenAI burned through literally millions of dollars worth of credits in order to just run this system to begin with. I mean, the runtime costs are something like $10 to $15 million just for this singular model. I think the main reason why you haven't seen the Chinese get into this is because they're not, there perhaps could be in the future, but a lot of that kind of compute power is still located in the United States. It's still cheaper. There's still this hardware, software implementation, this kind of, this duality that's happening in the United States that makes the computations cheap, which then allows for these products to even be created. So that part of it is also, I think, a very critical conversation. We haven't even really gotten into the unit economics, right? All of this is very different than all the software as a service. Software as a service is really huge upfront costs, but then you have like these very, very low marginal costs. This is not what we're looking at with any of these products. They're it looks more like a manufacturing or a factory than it does like a telephone company or an energy company. So all those things, like, I'm really focused on. I've been trying to do more work in this. If you have suggestions, let me put this out there. I have a lot of students who need work. So if you just need hard questions to be asked on, code data, I would be all ears for that, because we're trying to figure out the best ways to parse this data and to understand actually what's going on. And there's a lot also that is coming out in the near future on a lot of these questions as well.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue to another huge conversation that's going on right now, which is how should we build these systems, right? There's sort of the stable diffusion, open source, iterative model that people advocate for various reasons. There's also kind of the closed, for lack of a better word, the closed model, kind of the OpenAI model of, we're going to have a company, we're going to get VC money, we're going to go in, we're going to build it, and then we're going to sell it for either as a SaaS model or what have you. Kind of how are you thinking about that? Matt, I think you brought up the open source issue earlier. Obviously, this is a very computationally expensive thing to do, as Will just pointed out. But there's also sort of a collective action problem that goes into, one, building the database, and two, running the model and training the model. How are you thinking about the open source versus closed system kind of conversation that's going on?
I'm not like a super big expert on open source AI models, but I do worry in general about the economics of it all, because like he mentioned, it really does cost a lot of money to train these things. Like, you can have a lot of people coding things for free and adding into these code bases, but somebody's got to pay the bill at some point. And I'm not really sure which way that's going to go. Hogg is a company that has done a lot of open sourcing of this technology. They were able to pay for it through government grants. So if we're thinking about who's going to foot the bill, that's, I guess, one model that has allowed Hugging Face to compete with these giants. But otherwise, I'm not entirely sure how this is going to go. But in general, I'm very pro open source. I think it's a great way to get a different set of products into the market, right? Because the incentives are different. And AI systems are essentially creatures of incentives. They reflect the culture and the institutions which create them. And I think it would be very beneficial to humanity to have a very different set of incentives leading to the creation of these systems, other than company or government models, which would be, of course, the alternatives. And I think that would create a much better mix of things. And the open source communities have made all sorts of wonderful technologies that have been proven amazing and used time and time again. And I don't doubt that we could do that with artificial intelligence. We just need to figure out how to foot the bill. So perhaps government grants is one way to do that. We've seen that potentially work. I have to study the Hugging Face case a bit more specifically and see what strings perhaps the government of France, who funded it, put on their funding. And there's always going to be strings attached. But that's potentially one way we could have our cake and eat it too, in terms of having preserving open source development in addition to these closed down communities.
Well, Liz, I want to come to you with this next, because I think this is a really important conversation. Obviously, Matt brings in this kind of government component to it, and there's kind of, there's the build it and they will come kind of Andrew Will model, where you get a bunch of money up front, and then eventually you can get a government contract. There's also the NSF model, and obviously with the passage of CHIPS Plus, there's a lot of money flowing into some of these research components from the federal government. How are you thinking about this in that context? What would be the best model that you could think of for how to push forward and build these things in a way that's beneficial not only to the market but to consumers and kind of society as a whole?
I am once again going to shock you all by thinking that, by asserting that this is probably not something that government really ought to be stepping in and funding. I think we're seeing a ton of interest within VC world in funding this type of thing. We see that within the US, and then also per our most recent subject in China as well. Very robust VC networks, and so I see there being so much potential and promise using that system versus attempting to pursue the state funding model. I don't have too much thought on this specifically in terms of like which funding method is ideal, other than the general idea that government ought to stay out of that. But I would also add to the points that you guys were making about China. We always have to keep in mind that regulators always and everywhere, whether in the United States or in China, are very, very interested in reaching their grubby little hands in and attempting to put some guardrails on how these technologies are deployed. And so I think, on one hand, we see that happening a little bit in the United States, and I think you pointed to some very good examples in the medical field. But we also see this with regulators domestically within China. And so I think that's something that sometimes American audiences don't pay very much attention to. And clearly those regulators are operating based off of very different values with different preferences than US regulators are. But that's another piece of the puzzle. And if we neglect to pay any attention to that, we're absolutely going to be missing something major.
Interesting. Yeah, John, kind of turning to you. Do you think that there is a role for government funding in kind of the generative AI research, training, just building these systems at all? Because I think ChatGPT is a lot of fun, and it's fun to get it to write fun limericks or answer questions or get it to answer code. But there's a big question about whether that's that's not really a national security issue. Where is there a role for government, and if so, where?
Yeah, I mean, I always feel like the second we're talking about technology development, the sort of little red hen problem, right? The U.S. government has been funding generative AI research for like 30 years, right? Most of the foundations of it were supported by NSF grants, by DARPA grants. You look at all the work that's pouring in from the IED community to like visual classification algorithms in the 2000s. And at the very end, right when we're going to finally get some value out of it, okay, government's got to butt out and all the returns need to go to private VC. Otherwise, it'll be tyranny or something. So I don't really find that convincing. I'm very happy that there's a lot of VC money in it. But I would also hate, we need, this is a vast new terrain of intellectual property, for example. we need new regulatory framework simply because applying the old regulatory framework seems bizarre, and it would also restrict the technology in all kinds of ways. So I don't think it's a question of I don't think there's a world in which there isn't a regulatory framework applied to generative AI, if only because there already are regulatory frameworks applying very badly to generative AI. So let's think of some ones that are actually appropriate to the technology. When it comes to state uses of it, I think there are plenty of interesting cases ranging from implementation within government. Our federal government has extremely antiquated software systems. You can imagine a Manhattan Project to use Copilot to redo all of our software from Fortran. I can think of plenty of uses, and I would hate for American taxpayers to have to pay twice for a software for a system that they already paid to build.
Sorry, go ahead.
We're going to jump in. Go for it.
Yeah, this is something that I think is a really huge lost opportunity, because you could have basically first mover advantage in the fact that the government buys so much stuff. They buy a lot of stuff. You see it when you leave this city, you see it when you walk around, you see all of these consulting firms, and you see contractors, up the wazoo that make very, very good money and has made this area very, very wealthy. And still, we don't really have a good, when you look at the AI blueprints and you look a lot at the projects that the Biden administration in particular has been putting together, a lot of it's worried about data discrimination and issues of basically discrimination and bias. There is some mention of how can we use government as a buyer to actually bring about some of these technologies, but there's very little discussion of, how can we use these technologies to actually do a regulatory reset, to think about which parts of the code need to be taken out. The HHS had a program like this during the Trump administration. I was a huge, huge fan of it. It's called ESPER. And effectively, it just hasn't been reproduced. And I think that's what we need to be thinking about much more critically is, obviously, you got to be concerned about bias, and there is obviously a related set of problems there. But just as important is actually having a forward-thinking plan on how we're going to implement better technological systems, how we're going to make it such that you can actually have an agent that can help answer your questions if you have it with the IRS really easily. There's a lot of really good information actually on the IRS website that explains a lot of the concerns. If you were to put all of that into a easily recognizable chatbot, they'd be able to basically give you the majority of the answers you'd probably want, give you a citation, and then if you had further concerns, you could be popped to an IRS agent. Now, of course, this crowd probably doesn't really like the IRS all that much, but still, I think that these sorts of things that are what we should be looking to actually implement to make those systems more human-based, right? There's a lot of problems with the bureaucracy, and I think that there's a possibility of not replacing humans, but making a lot of this much more easy for us to actually navigate.
I do think on that note, there is this interesting question that is posed to libertarians, possibly many in this room, which, I was doing some research into this earlier this week, but this idea of the IRS recently got a huge funding boost, and many of us, I was not super keen on this, but then you actually look at some of the information that has come to light that some good reporters at the Washington Post have uncovered. And, IRS is now up to answering some 90% of customer calls and actually providing a much allegedly higher caliber of customer service and at least merely picking up the phone, right? I don't know if once they're actually on the phone, they're actually helping people file their tax returns effectively, but at the very least, getting a human on the other end to understand what's going on and to direct you, to point you in the right direction is certainly an improvement over the IRS's customer service before. So although I will be the first to criticize it, I think libertarians have this interesting question ahead of us where it's well, how much are we in favor of modernizing some of these very antiquated systems and making them more effective and more efficient? Are we sort of ideologically opposed to them functioning well at all? Do we just want to gridlock and dysfunction as far as the eye can see? Or are we interested in possibly devoting money toward these things functioning in a much better and more efficient manner? So I think libertarians will come down on both sides of that question, but that is something that perhaps more AI will be forcing us to consider within our ranks.
I think just on the note of government and implementing these things in systems like IRS phone calling, for example, to improve access and efficiency, I think overall the government funding challenge will be not getting caught in some sort of perfection trap, because I think the incentives of government, and especially key agencies like the IRS, will always be to have a no-fault system. They do not want anything embarrassing them. They do not want to lead anyone astray, and they, because they're regulators, fundamentally, that's how they see the world. And so they're going to see, if they ever see a system that's pretty good and definitely an improvement, but isn't perfect, they'll focus on the imperfections, not the usefulness of it. And what's going to happen, potentially, is these things could, if they start developing these systems for government applications, they could become essentially money holes, where they're throwing dollars after dollars into these systems because they're striving for a perfection that can never exist. Because these systems will frankly never be perfect. They'll be, we should strive for better, not perfection. But they'll be throwing money at this endlessly, striving for an unattainable goal, because that is the incentive of regulators. They do not want to have a weird, freaky chatbot on the other side of the IRS line. And unless they have something that will never make a mistake, I question whether or not they'll ever implement it, or whether or not, or I'll just wonder how much money they're going to end up throwing at the project overall.
Well, speak for yourself, Matt. I would really prefer a chatbot when dealing with the IRS. So I think just kind of bring this all back around. We've gotten some great ideas for how AI can benefit government and be implemented by government. But Will, you also brought up something really important that I don't think we really got some concrete examples on, which is what are some of the barriers to the implementation of these things? You know, concrete regulations, concrete laws, problems. Whether that be barriers to implementation within government or barriers to wonderful applications that can't exist because there are regulatory hurdles to them existing. I kind of just want to kind of go down the line. I guess we can start with Will, since you spurred the question.
Yeah, this to me is going to be a thankless task that'll probably end up coming down to maybe one of my students to start going through and actually try to figure out some of these things. You know, we've collected a lot of this. There's been a lot of shift, obviously, since COVID between different kind of regulatory rules, and I'm actually kind of excited about some of the newer work that's coming out that's trying to use these techniques to understand how, you know, regulatory code actually works in practice. That so to me, I think that we're going to be figuring out what that looks like in the near future. Again, some of the stuff that I'm watching. You know, pilots, there's stuff that's related to drones, there's stuff that's related to railway. It seems a lot of infrastructure material. There's a lot, obviously, in energy as well. Those, I think, are probably going to be the ones that are coming up the most clearly and most, they're going to be coming up the quickest. Other things that I think that we should really be conscientious of, and I don't know if I mentioned it here, but one of the things I rant about a lot is the fact that, you know, when we first adopted electricity, it took basically an entire generation of people to learn how to use electricity. So everyone was using, or most people were using, water mills of some sort. That's the reason why all the water mills existed. That's the reason why the Twin Cities exist at the falls of the Mississippi. Originally, a lot of the power was driven by water, and it took an entire generation. It took basically almost 40 years for a lot of these technologies, electricity, to actually come in. We saw a very similar thing with tractors as well, which is also kind of a famous example of this. And the reason I'm suggesting this is it takes time to figure out how to implement these systems into new ways of doing things. That entire switch over, that transition, that disruption takes usually a generation for these things to happen. So as much as I think we do need to be conscientious, there is a wave of new applications and things happening. Where this is really going to be potentially disruptive are in areas that I think we'll still have to wait to see how they get implemented in a very, very real way. Because right now, we haven't really seen any of these big, bold changes that were predicted even less than 10 years ago. So I don't know, I'm bearish. I'm bullish on the technology, I'm positive about it, but when you look and see what's happened over the last 10 years, it's like it just feels like another of the AI hype cycles. And having been through one of them, I'm kind of like, I mean, it'll be nice if we can get these things to work, but that's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of money. It's going to take billions of dollars. It's going to take failures like IBM's Watson, right? IBM's Watson was literally like this. It was supposed to be amazing, and now it's been stripped apart. All of the healthcare assets have been sold. So these things are not easy to do, and it's just surprising to me that there's reason to be optimistic, but I don't think that we should, we shouldn't be getting rid of our jobs tomorrow and leaving our work, because I just don't think it's going to be an easy swift transition.
Well, Liz, so taking the optimistic view and thinking 5-10 years ahead, what are you most bullish on, and what barriers do you see to getting to that place?
Well, I think the biggest barrier will actually be denial, right? Like there is this whole class of people, probably pretty much everybody in this room, who for a long time thought that creativity was the human realm, and that we could in no way be, trumped by the machines. And I think now this will really cause us to evaluate, is that true? When we see AI art generators, where basically there are these artists, visual artists, who had long been actually physically doing work with their hands to generate beautiful images. Well, actually now a lot of them are transitioning to being prompt feeders. So it's all about the skill of coming up with the appropriate prompt, and then seeing what is generated by that, and then determining from there what is permissible and what ought to be released to the public, to their audiences. But that's a really different role, and that requires, if your concept up until that point has been that you are a visual artist who actually does this with your hands, that's a really, really different role that you're going to be playing. So I think this causes us to fundamentally reevaluate our role to creativity, or our relationship to creativity, and I think a lot of people are going to have a really hard time swallowing that pill. However, I do think there is also a lot of hope, because with each new technology, there is always a little bit of an adoption curve. It frequently takes an awful long time for people to be comfortable with it. It's frequently the big city educated elites who have the easiest time adopting these things, but slowly it trickles down to many, many other people, and lots of people see the uses for it. But fear not. Even though we all have these like lovely little Instagram-y, TikTok algorithms on our phones, we still do things in meat space. This is still something that we get value and fulfillment from. We still, with the exception of some really miserable looking Zoom weddings, we still get married in person. We still come together to celebrate life's big events in rooms like this one, or possibly, people's homes. We still have house parties. We still have rituals. We still attend church, and I at least turn my phone off every single Sunday when I'm going into Catholic Mass, because this is just a place for reverence, and it's not really a place for me to be in any way tempted by Instagram. And so I think it is worth remaining somewhat focused on the idea that so much of what makes life worth living still occurs in meat space. And that's a really hopeful and optimistic thing. So if ever you feel disheartened by this coming wave that might sweep you off your feet and take you into these unseen territories, I don't think that is actually what this technology will do. I think it will make us a little bit more efficient and a little bit more productive, and force us to reevaluate the ways in which maybe we're a little more like machines than we thought.
Well, John, not to give you the pessimistic version of that, but to flip it, right? What are you in 5-10 years most concerned about, or concerned might happen, and how do we mitigate that risk? How do we, head off that problem?
Yeah.
Or you can just go optimistic.
No. I'll go.
Come to my side.
No. I'll go pessimistic. I mean, I think that the danger of this technology is the same danger of every great technology, which is idolatry. And I think AI presents the greatest temptation to idolatry of any technology we've yet created. Right? The desire to see in it something greater than ourselves, something that can speak to us in a way that independent from ourselves. It's the tendency to project agency or humanity onto it, and to take or to lower our view of ourselves onto its level, so to speak. I mean, already these are the temptations that are facing us. I mean, there are people who are spending billions of dollars ignoring very real human problems to talk about, what's the computer going to do next. So I think that is and will remain the great danger of this technology.
Matt, I want to give you the last word here. Where do you see us in 10 years? I mean, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Are you somewhere in the middle? Do you think we're going to lose humanness?
Yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm not I don't consider myself like an AI hypester per se. I really try and make an effort to look at the technology as it is today and empirically observe how is it being used, what is its challenges today, and how do we face those challenges. I really try and not get not to get lost in the hype cycle. But in terms of the currents that we're seeing in terms of AI development, I think that as a technology, there's some very promising things. Just this month, we discovered there's a concept called a scaling law, which is essentially some mathematics that dictate how big you can make a model, like in terms of just raw lines of code, parameters, to how big you can make it and still get benefit out of that. And they just discovered a new scaling law for a type of learning called reinforcement learning, which we haven't had a scaling law for before. And essentially what this means is for that type of machine learning, type of AI, and a type very useful for things like autonomous systems, drones, driverless cars, it's going to be a very safe bet because we have this law that says if you invest more and make the model bigger, it will improve. And there's some mathematics behind this. Meaning, I think there's going to be some new dollars funneling into these things, new dollars that are almost certainly to squeeze out some benefits and improve autonomy in these key areas, these key practical applications like drones and driverless cars and basically everything else that uses reinforcement learning. And this is a technology that is broadly applicable beyond autonomous systems, but that's where my mind goes. And so in terms of that, I mean, that's something that came out literally this month. That's a very bright future because we haven't squeezed the juice out of that discovery quite yet. And so I think there's a lot of legs in terms of future innovation. In terms of pessimism, I would say that I am worried about the speed. You were talking about the speed, Liz, earlier, and of how these things are developing. And I think for a lot of people that will end up being a challenge. Perhaps it will take a generation to get over these things. I literally, yesterday, I saw a Change.org petition of thousands of people signed this thing saying, turn off the evil Bing bot, which, clearly this stuff isn't socialized yet, right? Like, people haven't socialized, society hasn't encountered it yet.
You want AI socialism?
No, that's not what I mean. Socialize in the other meeting. People need time to get used to this stuff, right? Most people haven't used these apps. Everyone in this room perhaps has, but you'd be surprised at who has not even heard of ChatGPT. I mentioned this event to my mom last night, and she said, "Oh, what's ChatGPT?" Right? So, the broader public isn't necessarily in tune with these things, let alone aware of the bias issues and stochastic parrots and all these other concepts, right? And so I think it's just going to take some time, and people are going to have to get used to it, and that's going to cause some growing pains, and it's going to cause a lot of fear. People are going to misattribute sentience to these things, and we're going to have to work through that. But that's the scary thing, and I think we'll get over it in time. But it's something we're going to have to work through, and hopefully we don't build sentience policy in the meantime just because people are afraid of these things. That's one concern. So I think we just need to be very reserved and let things play out as best as possible.
I do think it's funny, we got all the way through, almost all the way through without anyone bringing up sentience.
Yeah, I wanted to ruin it for you.
Ruined it.
I ruined it, yeah.
No, but I think cautious optimism is the theme of our conversation today. And, it's wonderful to see that there's a lot of hand-wringing, as I said at the very beginning. There's a lot of anxiety. There's also a lot of kind of bloviation around this. And so I think it's just important for everyone to continue that cautious optimism and look at these things in a critical way and don't get caught up in the hype cycle, as you said. So with that, thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you again for listening.
Yeah, guys. Thank you.
Sorry, just one thing. We if you guys are interested in learning more, I work for Mercatus Center. If you go to mercatus.org, and we actually have some handouts for this. We just published today an AI primer, so if you want to learn more about this technology and policy issues, you can look to that. Ask me for some more info.
Seamless plug. I love it.
Yeah.
I kind of want one of those papers.
Anybody else got a plug? Nothing? Okay. Guys, thank you so much for coming. I just want to say thank you to our panelists, obviously all of them incredibly learned and insightful on these things. Hopefully they will stick around. We're going to have obviously more drinks, there's more food, plenty of it. So please do. I just want to throw in my own shameless plug and say, please come to more of our round robins. We want to have more of these sort of dialogues with lots of different issues from all different sides of the aisle. Obviously, these people did it without coming to any blows, so it can be done despite what Twitter tells you. So anyway, give it up for our panelists.